Welcome everyone to a brand new reaction series. We are going to dive back into the deep well that is extra history. This is actually a series that goes back 7 years, I believe. It's called The Resource War, and as I am preparing for my trip to France next week, and a lot of that's going to be focused on Normandy and the invasion beaches, been doing kind of a deep dive into World War II history the last few weeks on my own. So I'm excited to study one of the most important aspects of the war. Listen, by the time you get to the 20th century, World War I, World War II, the other wars that take place during this time, what happens on the front lines is only a tiny fraction of what goes into winning these wars, because you've got the mass scale of production that has to take place in factories on the home front. You've got to feed these millions and millions of soldiers. The U.S. alone, had like 16 million men and women in their armed forces by the end of the war, and we weren't even the largest. I mean, I think the Soviet Union probably had more. The Germans probably had a similar number to that. And then you have the Japanese and the Chinese and India and the British Empire, and which India was a part of at that time, and the French and all these other dozens of nations that were involved in this war. So intelligence is a huge factor. Being able to transport goods and supplies and weapons is a huge factor. Dominating the skies and the seas matter. Technology matters. All of it plays a role in winning this war. So the resource war is a part of that. So I'm excited to dive into this. As always, the link is in the description. If you'd like to go ahead and watch their entire series, I would encourage that. Watch the whole series, then come back and watch my commentary over the coming days as we add to and we learn together. Let's dive into the resource war.
Cicero once said that the sinews of war were infinite money. Never has that been more true than in the Second World War. This little bonus extra history series is going to be all about the complex economic struggle that underpinned the most colossal conflict in human history. These episodes are happening courtesy of the good folks at Paradox, who, after seeing those old Punic Wars episodes we made, approached us asking to sponsor a few episodes about the economic aspects of World War II, in anticipation of the upcoming release of Hearts of Iron 4.
Holy cow, so this was all the way back when Hearts of Iron 4 came out. One of my all-time favorite PC games. I've done a bunch of series playing Hearts of Iron 4 over on the gaming channel, VTH Gaming. The link's in the description if you haven't already checked out the gaming channel.
It's a great topic idea, so let's jump right in. First, let me set the stage. The year is 1939. Storm clouds are gathering over Europe. Hitler has already grabbed Austria, and Czechoslovakia is being gobbled up. The Italians have conquered Albania. Even as many try to deny it, every nation knows war is coming. Meanwhile, in the east, the Japanese have annexed Manchuria and are pushing further into China. Chinese resistance movements have flared up. For all intents and purposes, the East is already at war.
Yeah, and a lot of people will say that they really don't consider World War II to have begun September 1st, 1939 with the German invasion of Poland, but rather point to what Japan is doing in East Asia. With China, Manchuria, things like that. You can make that argument, but I think 1939 typically is pointed to because it brings several new world powers into this thing. You got to remember, think about just, for example, the rise to power of the National Socialists is enabled in part because of economic issues that are happening in Germany. World War I was largely won because of an economic blockade of German ports by the British Empire with their navy. And World War II is going to be driven by economics, right? The U.S. and Japan are going to go to war in large part because of access to oil. So this is a big part of it. You can have the most technologically advanced army in the world. You can have the best of everything, and you can have the most of everything. But if once the war starts, you're cut off from the ability to get your army's needs in terms of oil or rubber or aluminum or chromium or whatever it might be, your long-term prospects are not great.
But most of the major players all have one goal in mind: resources. Economic power, industrial installations, natural resources. These all needed to be gathered and hoarded as quickly as possible because
And, the argument is there to be made that, well, people say, well, what was Hitler thinking? It was so stupid for attacking the Soviet Union. And part of it was ideological. He viewed Russians, he called them Bolsheviks, the same way he viewed Jewish people, for example, as like lesser human beings. But a lot of it was economic as well, trying to get access to those oil fields in the Caucasus. If you have a massive army and you don't have the resources at home, you've got to gather them somewhere. And that leads you to make decisions you might not otherwise make.
every state knows when war truly breaks all bounds, all the trade that keeps the world economy functioning will grind to a halt. Or so it was thought. In fact, many expected that the European nations would avoid war because their economies couldn't survive economic isolation. But that assumption hadn't kept the First World War from breaking out, and it wouldn't keep the Second. In truth, many of the pre-war planners had learned from the First World War and started preparing for just such a breakdown in trade years.
That's a great point, is that, a lot of people argued that World War I could never last 4 years because the countries wouldn't be able to economically afford to keep their armies going, but they found a way. But this time, those lessons have been learned, and so you're looking at your economy and you're thinking, okay, what is it going to cost us economically and in resources to be able to fight such a war, and who are we going to have to conquer to do it? And what are we going to have to save up for? What infrastructure do we need to be building now? All that stuff.
In advance. So let's take a look at the economies of some of the major players right at the outset of the war. The first big three are Germany, France, and Great Britain. These are the major European nations that would be in direct conflict with each other from the get-go. Germany, having been disarmed after World War I, had come roaring out of the Great Depression with one of the largest armaments programs the world had ever seen. France had invested heavily in static defenses, and Great Britain had restarted its fleet construction program after the...
So, I'll back up there just so we don't miss what he was saying, but a lot of industrialized nations used works programs, public works programs, to help kind of drive their way out of the Depression. Here in the United States, for example, you have things like the Tennessee Valley Authority. You have infrastructure projects, right? The government's investing money into things it needs, but it's also employing a lot of citizens and pouring money into the economy. Well, Germany did that too, but what Germany did was that it focused much more heavily on the military aspect of production early on, whereas countries like the U.S. didn't really start ramping up their military till 1940.
Invested heavily in static defenses, and Great Britain had restarted its fleet construction program after the lull for the Washington Naval Treaty. But to really compare these countries, we're going to have to talk numbers. The way I see it, there are 4 statistics you really have to consider when talking about countries involved in a global war. First, GDP, or Gross Domestic Product. This tells you roughly how big an economy is, how much raw production it's capable of, which of course translates directly into tanks, bombs, guns, the material of war.
And that's true. The only thing that can be a little misleading about GDP is if you have a massive country, then maybe that GDP isn't as impressive as if you have a small country that's kind of punching above its weight in terms of its GDP. So that's where things like per capita income come into play.
Second, population. When we're looking at massive global conflicts that are going to determine the very survival of nations, you've got to look at the manpower they can draw upon. The larger the population, the larger the armies that nation can field, with more industrialized countries being able to draw on larger sections of their populace without disrupting the flow of basic goods like grain.
So yeah, again, same thing. Look at the massive numbers. The U.S. enlists something like 16 million men and women in the military. And those are all men and women who are no longer working in factories, that are no longer producing food on farms, that are no longer raising their children. All of that has to be accounted for in all of this. So the larger your population, the more men you can send to the front and still have people to run your factories and feed your armies back home.
If a conflict becomes a long-term struggle, population count becomes increasingly important as attrition starts to mount. Third, territorial extent. This isn't a perfect measure by any stretch, but it serves to give us a surface-level idea of relative natural resource control. In modern economies that require everything from oil to rubber to aluminum to run, territorial extent gives us a very rough idea of how self-sufficient these economies might be if cut off from global trade. It also tells us how much ground a nation can give up without being knocked out of the fight. Though it is worth noting that greater territorial extent also generally makes mobilization more difficult and defense more complex. So it's kind of...
That's true, but for example, in World War I, the mistake was made by Germany thinking that Russia was so huge and therefore would be slow to mobilize. And they ended up mobilizing much faster than Germany expected them to. And it also gives you that advantage that Napoleon discovered and the Germans discovered, that you can attack hundreds of miles into Russia, or in World War II, the Soviet Union, and still not even be close to entering the heart of their nation. And that also stretches you further and further away from your supply lines. And it gives you this long area that you have to defend.
Kind of a trade-off in some ways. Fourth, per capita income. Individual wage may seem like a strange metric when thinking about wartime economy, but it gives you a good idea of how developed an economy is. The higher the individual wage, the more advanced an economy you're usually dealing with. And this is actually super important because, in general, larger economies can take bigger hits without crumbling. Bombing one factory won't cause production to grind to a halt. They'll have a greater ability to synthesize or find alternatives for natural resources they don't have. They have a better internal network for transportation and distribution and such. So a nation that has a more advanced economy, even if it has the same GDP as another country, can remain an effective combatant much longer than a nation with a less advanced economy.
And here's another, and I just learned this the other day in a book I'm reading about World War II, just little things you don't really have a way of accounting for. For example, when the war breaks out, World War II, in the United States, something like 1 in 4 American families owned an automobile. So, today, pretty much most people have a car. But at that time, it wasn't that way. But in Germany, it was something like 1 in 50. Well, that makes a difference when it comes to people being familiar with vehicles, even tanks, things like that. The more familiar your country is with operating such vehicles, the more that translates into the military. But also, that means that you have more of a means of production for things like tanks. Because a lot of places, they went from making cars to making tanks or making Jeeps or making other vehicles. And you've already got that infrastructure for being able to do that, both in terms of the knowledge that your people have, but also the production factories that you have.
This is why China collapsed into a guerrilla war almost immediately rather than fronting a centralized state effort. And it's why Italy capitulated so much quicker than Germany. It's also fascinating to think about in terms of the incredible Soviet effort to actually pick up and move their entire industrial base in the face of a German invasion. But we'll get to that later. For right now, let's look at some numbers. Now, all of the monetary figures I'm going to use here are in 1990 US dollars, just because that's how the most comprehensive data set I found converted it. So, the UK has a population of 47.5 million, a territorial reach of 245,000 square kilometers, a GDP of $284.2 billion, and a per capita income of about $5,983.
So I'm wondering now, does that apply to the entire British Empire, or are we talking specifically just the UK?
Now, when compared to Germany's numbers, with a population of 68.6 million, 470,000 square kilometers of territory, a GDP of 351.4 billion, and a per capita income of 5,126 per head, the UK's numbers may look a bit low. But first, we've got to factor in France, which had a population of 42 million, a territorial reach of 551.
Germany has some, yes. They've got some in Africa, some in the South Pacific, but for the most part, France and the UK have just massive access to resources. French Indochina, for example, which is Vietnam and others today. Even the Netherlands has the Dutch East Indies.
1,000 square kilometers, a GDP of 185.6 billion, and a per capita income of $4,424. And perhaps far more importantly, we also have to factor in the British Empire. If you add in all of the colonies and dominions that Britain held at the time, that's a whopping 483.8 million people, 34,179,000 square kilometers in territory, and 391 billion in GDP. But granted, if you leave out some of the more economically advanced dominions like Canada and Australia, the colony's collective per capita GDP was only $627, so less great. Sorry, I know that was a lot of numbers, but what does it all tell us? All of those numbers basically tell us that Germany needed to win this war before the UK could bring its empire to bear.
Yep.
But it also tells us that the British Empire was unwieldy. It was spread out, and it had an incredibly low per capita GDP in a lot of places, which meant that there wasn't a lot in those places that could be diverted to war production, and those sections of the empire would probably collapse at the first show of hostile force. And that reality very much played into the overarching strategy of the war. Blitzkrieg was not only a tactical or even a strategic idea, but an operational one. Germany had stockpiled material before the war. They believed they had better military leadership and better esprit de corps. Their great hope was to expand fast enough using those early advantages to win total victory. But
Yeah, so again, the idea here is we know that the longer a war goes on, the less likely it is for us to win. So we've got to win fast, and hope that's enough. And the Japanese had the same idea in striking the United States at Pearl Harbor, right? They knew there was no way they could win a long-term conflict with the Americans in the Pacific. So you make a quick strike. You hope that gives you enough time to do what you need to do to build yourself up, and then hope that the U.S. is set back to the point where they won't be willing to pursue this long term.
Their more realistic planning told them that they still had no choice but to expand rapidly, so that they could bring in the resources, population, and industrial capacity that they would need to fight a protracted war. Seizing an early advantage was Germany's best chance. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Japan was in much the same situation. The famous Japanese Admiral Yamamoto estimated that he could win for 6 months if the US entered the war.
Yep.
But if Japan had not secured victory by then, loss was assured. If we look at the statistics for Japan and China, which I'll put down below just so I don't belabor you with more numbers, we can see that China has a substantially higher population, and thus also a higher GDP, but a much lower per capita
There you
GDP. Meaning that China would probably lose a conventional war, but they'd still be very hard to occupy if they got any outside help. And then there were the two wild cards, the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had vast natural resources, a huge population, and a high GDP, but with a low per capita wage, meaning they had a less advanced economy than many of the other European powers. Russia would play an enormous role in the struggle to come, but economically, its entire focus would be using what industrial resources it had to arm and equip the vast forces it could muster. The United States, on the other hand, for the entire length of the war, from 1938, well before it was involved, to the war's conclusion in 1945, had a GDP greater than every major Axis power combined. A GDP which was also greater than all the other major allies put together. Not only that, but the US was protected by oceans from the conflict itself. This is why the United States would serve as the arsenal of democracy. Join us next time as we talk about Lend-Lease and how American industrial output would be used to keep its beleaguered, soon-to-be allies afloat before the American nation gathered the will to fight. See you then.
Yeah, great point is that, World War I and World War II both. The U.S. is neutral at the beginning, but not really neutral. They're economically supporting the Allies in both of those wars, and especially in World War II. But this is going to be fascinating. I think we're going to learn a lot, and I think this is such a unstated, much understated part of how the war was won. So I'm excited to dive into it. Use the comment section below. Let me know your thoughts. We'll be back tomorrow with part 2. Thanks for watching. Welcome back, everyone, as we continue our look at the Resource War from Extra History. If you didn't see episode 1 of my reaction, the link's in the description, as well as the link to the original content. I would encourage you to watch the entire series on your own, and then come back for the reactions and my additional commentary. So let's go ahead and dive into part 2 and see what's going on.
The year is 1941. World War II is entering its 3rd year. France has collapsed, and Great Britain is barely holding on, a last bulwark of democracy against the tide of fascism. Dictatorship rules Europe, and the sleeping giant of the United States has yet to wake. With the collapse of France in 1940, the situation in Europe becomes clear.
So while this, we use that phrase, waking a sleeping giant, which was attributed to Admiral Yamamoto, almost certainly didn't say it. The quote is something like, "I fear all we've done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." While he didn't say it, the sentiment is absolutely true, but it's fair to say that by 1941, late 1941, it's not like the U.S. is sitting around sleeping and waiting for World War II to happen to them. Franklin Roosevelt and his administration have been doing some things. The draft has been reinstituted. They're starting to build up the military. They're starting to build up the infrastructure that's going to be needed for this. Things are happening. The ball has gotten rolling somewhat.
Without resources from the U.S., all resistance to the Nazi military machine would collapse, no matter how bravely the small island nation of Britain tried to hold out. But America was opposed to war. In fact, it goes further. America was opposed to any intervention at all. In the 1930s, the U.S. had passed the Neutrality Act, which not only established that it wasn't going to get involved with foreign wars, but went further with the prevailing American isolationism of the time and declared that America wasn't going to sell arms to nations at war.
So you have to remember that for most of U.S. history, the prevailing thought has been, we'll stay out of European affairs and Europe stays out of American affairs, meaning North and South America. The Monroe Doctrine. That all changes with World War I when the U.S. gets involved. That's really our first time getting involved in intervention in a way that isn't immediately on our borders. That wasn't thrust on us. Yeah, listen, all the way back to Thomas Jefferson's administration, you have the war with the Barbary Pirates, and during Washington and Adams administrations, there have been concerns about getting pulled into a European war that we weren't directly involved in. And of course, the War of 1812, but again, that was mostly fought in North America.
Roosevelt saw the threat that Nazi Germany posed and desperately wanted to find ways to support the British war effort, but the Neutrality Acts kept his hands tied. When Czechoslovakia fell, he lobbied Congress to renew an old provision in the Neutrality Act called cash and carry, but his efforts were rebuffed. Then Poland fell, and things started to look grim. Finally, on November 5th, 1939, cash and carry was renewed. But cash and carry was a limited provision. It allowed for the sale of material to Britain and France, but only if they paid in cash for the material and transported it all back to Europe themselves. No U.S. ship was to enter a war zone. At first, this worked, but as the years dragged on and France fell, Britain found itself hemorrhaging its reserves. The Battle of Britain and the campaigning in North Africa had been bleeding it dry. There simply was no more cash in the UK, and even the British fleet was being stretched thin. In 1940, Roosevelt established a policy allowing the trade of destroyers to the British in exchange for bases in British colonies. This policy was definitely pushing the limits of the Neutrality Act, but technically it wasn't violating the terms of cash and carry because the British were trading for the ships rather than buying them, and hey.
So basically, when you are hamstrung by your nation's own policies and you are the executive and you see very clearly what needs to be done, you find ways to bend it as much as possible. This is what Abraham Lincoln did during the Civil War. You could argue pretty strongly that he went a little further than bending the law, but you will push and push and push and do whatever you feel needs to be done if the circumstances demand it. It's that whole attitude of it's better to ask forgiveness than permission.
Hey, ships do a pretty good job of transporting themselves, so there you go. This deal really shows the desperation of the situation, though. Roosevelt risked a potentially illegal action because everyone, his staff, and even much of the British staff saw the capitulation of the British Empire as inevitable. In 1940, everyone thought Britain was on the ropes.
And think about what happens if Britain goes down, right? Everything that happens for the United States in Europe is predicated on using Britain as the home base. Going into North Africa, going into Italy from North Africa, going into Normandy. All of this is heavily dependent on the British, on their navy, on their land to be able to launch these. And Britain falls. I don't see a great scenario where the U.S. is able to help the way that they do.
Weeks from being taken down. And so, as a last Hail Mary, this destroyers for bases deal put U.S. bases on British colonies so that they wouldn't simply fall into Nazi hands. But fortunately, the Battle of Britain was won, and now the U.S. had to enter into more long-term thinking. It was time for Lend-Lease. This is one of the critical turning points in the Second World War. It's right up there with the German invasion of the Soviet Union and the United States finally deciding to fully commit to war. Without Lend-Lease, the UK almost certainly would have fallen. Fascists would gain control over all of Europe, and even if the US later decided to enter the war, they'd have no jumping off point for a European campaign. But Lend-Lease at last meant that the complete industrial power of the U.S. would be committed to combating the Nazi war machine. With Lend-Lease, the U.S. had finally picked a side. You see, the idea behind Lend-Lease was simple. The U.S. would give its strategic partners, and I say strategic partners because they're not allies yet, massive amounts of war material for the duration of the war.
So what's a strategic partner? It's somebody who's got the same interests and the same goals and the same values that you do, or at least that's how you see it. And if you're looking at this, you're like, okay, we're not involved as a belligerent in this conflict, but as a strategic thinker, obviously we have a lot more in common, and our country has a lot more interest in the survival of Britain than in the victory for Nazi Germany.
After which these strategic partners were supposed to give that material back. Funny thing about war material, though, not a lot of it tends to come back in the same condition you lent it out in. And the US knew this. This was essentially the largest donation of war material in the history of mankind. And it wasn't just tanks and bombs. It was foodstuffs and telephone cabling. It was trucks and clothing. Heck.
And this wasn't just to the UK. A lot of resources from the United States are poured into the Soviet Union as well. We talk all the time about the Soviet Union basically carrying the ball for the Allies on the Eastern Front, but despite their huge amount of manpower and resources that they have, without that assistance from the Allies, especially the United States, they don't hold off Germany in the East.
Heck, the U.S. even shipped 2,000 locomotives and 11,000 train cars over to the USSR to bolster their rail infrastructure. This was a huge portion of the U.S. economy going to cover the material cost of the war, while other nations were carrying the bulk of the human cost. And the sheer size of this effort is indescribable. It helped to drag the U.S. out of the Great Depression and galvanized American production. It meant sending millions of tons overseas, shipping on a scale heretofore unimaginable during times of war. It meant giving away more goods than the entire world would have been able to produce annually a mere 75 years before.
Yeah, and listen, I'm not here to get into the political debate of Franklin Roosevelt's domestic policies and whether they helped pull the U.S. out of the Depression or prolonged it. That's for economists and people far smarter than me to do. But it is obvious looking at this. And granted, the numbers say that the Depression was over by this point. But the speed at which the U.S. is able to pull out of the Depression and turn things into a booming economy depends a lot on this stuff, on Lend-Lease, and then later on the war itself.
But like all things, this decision wasn't as straightforward as we sometimes like to think of it. Looking back on it today, it's easy to see the results of this Herculean task and how fully America threw herself into the effort, and just assume that the entire nation was unified behind this cause, that it had broad support. But democracies are, by design, messy things, and even on the issue of Lend-Lease, voting in the US Congress was split almost exactly down party lines. But once the measure was passed, America really did embrace this decision to truly be the arsenal of democracy, to be the engine of war for the anti-fascist world. And that leads me to a particular group I'd like to talk about. A group who's too rarely remembered and celebrated. A group whose battles were rarely glorious. They never took cities or gained territory, but they're the group of Americans who risked their lives earliest and sacrificed the most. They had higher casualty percentages than any of the other American armed services during the war, and they, very arguably, saved the free world. I would like to take this moment to acknowledge the service of the Merchant Marine. These are the men and women who serve as sailors to transport goods during wartime. They served in unarmed civilian ships, hauling necessary supplies to Allied forces throughout the war. Sailing the Atlantic, every day they faced the harrowing dread of the submarine. At any moment, they might lose their lives to an unseen and invisible vessel far below the waves. They served simply as prey, unable to fight back against an enemy that might at any time strike without warning. To die asphyxiating in a steel tomb or freezing in the unforgiving waters of the Atlantic are horrors that no one would want to face, and yet these sailors faced that every day. Let
me show you some statistics on this. So first of all, here's a statistic that shows you the percentage of deaths based on the area of service. So the Coast Guard lost 1 in 421 died during the war. In the Navy, it was 1 in 114. In the Army, it was 1 in 48. In the Marines, it was 1 in 34, and in the Merchant Marine, it was 1 in 26. So about 4% of those who served in the U.S. Merchant Marine died during the war. Something like 5,000 ships, U.S. and Allied ships, were sunk in the Atlantic over the course of the war, nearly 200 of them being actual Navy warships. Just massive numbers in terms of the tonnage. Something like 800 submarines are sunk in the Atlantic during the war. We can't wrap our minds around just the sheer number of ships that were sunk, and yet how small of a percentage that was of the total shipping that goes across. Because if you're talking 5,000 ships were lost, and yet so many made it over there, it's just the scale of the logistics of this war are mind-boggling.
For glory, but simply because it was a job that needed to be done. And these threats were so real and omnipresent that the Merchant Marine became one of the first uses of statistical operations research. The frequency of attacks on the Merchant Marine presented enough data for decisions to be made about the optimal size of a convoy and the escort it might require. Evidence all gathered off the backs of broken ships and drowned sailors.
So you want a really good look at what this was like for a convoy going across. It's fictional, but the movie Greyhound with Tom Hanks is fantastic. It's intense, and it shows you what these folks went through just to get across the Atlantic one time. Really good.
But despite all of this, many of the men and women of the Merchant Marine signed up for voyage after voyage, returning to the seas to make sure that the material of Lend-Lease always got through. And though the U.S. wouldn't officially enter the war for 9 more months, Lend-Lease made members of the Merchant Marine some of the first U.S. citizens to give their lives for the Allied cause in World War II. And in doing so, though their sacrifice is rarely celebrated, they helped change the course of history. Join us next week as we look more closely at how the lack of specific natural resources drove Axis policy, and explore how many of the synthetic products we know today came to be during the Second World War.
Necessity is the mother of invention. Say it all the time. Good stuff. And to anyone watching who served in the U.S. Merchant Marine, thank you for what you do. You are not a forgotten part of our armed forces, and we can see right there how vitally important they were to the war effort. So hope you enjoyed that. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, and we'll be back tomorrow with the next episode. Thanks for watching. Welcome back, everyone, as we dive into part 3 of the Resource War. I'm excited that you guys have been enjoying this series as much as I have. Loving the comments that you're all leaving, which has really added to the conversation and helped us to learn so much together, which is the whole point of all of this. So if you have not seen the first 2 episodes of my reaction to this series, the link's in the description, as well as the original content. Please check them out. Check out all of their great stuff over on Extra History. This is one of their earliest video series. Really been enjoying it. Really been enjoying preparing for my trip to France next week. A lot more to come about that, but you're going to be seeing videos from Normandy. You're going to be seeing videos with me, with some of our other favorite content creators, as well as some famous faces from Band of Brothers. And then, of course, I'm returning to the Somme to do a second, at least 6-part series about the fight there. Let's dive into the Resource War.
To understand the strategic decisions of the Second World War, you have to understand the struggle for resources that underpinned it. All wars to some extent are about resources, but this war was like no other conflict in history. To power the vast engine of war, to feed the complex machine that churned out tanks and bombs, trucks and ships, that kept millions of men fed, armed, and clothed in the field, the combatants of World War II needed a diversity and a quantity of natural resources heretofore unconsidered in the annals of military planning.
Yeah, that's a great point. And if you think back to, early wars, right? Let's go back to the Romans. What do you need to be able to keep an army in the field? Well, I mean, obviously they need their armor and they need their weapons. But beyond that, you need food and water. And that's really kind of it. I mean, you need access to wood to be able to build fires and to make fortifications and things like that. But really, it's about feeding the army. If you feed the army can fight. Then you move up to, say, the age of muskets, and now you need powder. And you need ammunition, and you need guns, and you have to replace those guns as things go wrong with them because they're mechanical, so things go wrong. You need artillery, and you need the munitions for the artillery and the powder for the artillery, and you need food and all of those things and more. And then as you advance now to the 20th century, now you're talking about needing oil and needing replacement parts for vehicles and for tanks and all of the things that those things need. And you need water, and you need huge amounts of artillery rounds, and you need to produce all of this stuff back home, and then you need to get it to where it is used. And as war becomes more complex, not only do the tactics need to change and adapt, but also the logistics, it just becomes infinitely more complex.
And everybody knew that if they didn't get those resources, it would just be a matter of time before the all-consuming engine of battle ground to a halt. It was this fear that drove the Axis planning throughout much of the war. If we look at the Allies, we see an unimaginable wealth of resources. There were the oil and coal fields of Russia, the vast farmland, minerals, and refineries of the United States, and the far-flung empires of France and Britain, which could draw in exotic resources from across the globe. Now compare that to the Axis, with the small island nation of Japan and the largely landlocked and non-colonial powers of Germany and Italy. The Allies could fuel the war on resources they already had. If the Axis was going to last at all, they needed to make up for what they lacked in war gains. And this dictated early policy. The Nazis knew they were going to lose their supplies of cobalt, copper, and most importantly, oil as soon as the war began in earnest, for they had imported most of those materials from their soon-to-be enemies, so they needed to find an alternative.
So let's think about this for a minute. Let's say, just in an alternate world, that Japan and Germany have access to the oil they need and the resources they need, other resources to be able to fuel the war machine. Japan doesn't have a need to go after the United States, and Germany doesn't have a need other than an ideological one to go after the Soviet Union. In that situation, what does the war look like? Do they win? Or does it at least get prolonged because you don't bring the U.S. into the war? You don't bring the Soviets into the war with whom the Germans have a non-aggression pact. Different world we're looking at. Resources, the need for those resources drives the things that we look at as being the bad decisions that cost the Axis the war.
Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviet Union not only assured that the Germans wouldn't have to fight a two-front war, but also laid out in great detail a trade agreement that would have the USSR provide Germany with the supplies of those resources it would need to prosecute the war. Next, the German planners had to tackle their lack of aluminum and iron, and this served as part of the impetus for the invasion of Norway. Not only would Norway serve as an excellent location for aluminum production, but it secured German access to Sweden, which is where the vast bulk of their iron imports came from. But the Germans would also need food if they were going to feed and field an army of millions, and France served as one of the most fertile regions in Europe. With a rapid conquest of France, Germany could also hope to secure strategic reserves that would buy them some time to pin down the other resources they were lacking.
And the rapid conquest of France is exactly what they were after in the First World War and failed to achieve. But in the Second World War, they were able to accomplish that. So it's interesting. You see how there was a strategic reason for going after each one of these nations.
And so there's the first 2 years of the war. Other concerns certainly factored into the strategic decision-making, but step by step, throughout the early war, you can follow the need to shore up the resources the German economy lacked. But even after the massive German expansion of 1940, this left German planners with one great concern: oil. Even after Nazi efforts to support fascists in Romania brought the Romanian oil fields under their control, the German war machine was consuming about 25% more oil than even the expanded Reich could produce. Month after month, this shortfall was being made up for by shipments from the USSR, but Nazi planners and the Nazi leadership lived in a state of continual paranoia where the looming and perhaps quite real possibility of Stalin simply cutting off oil shipments would spell an end to the Reich.
And this is where I find myself in disagreement with, or at least in conflict with, a lot of others when it comes to the rationale for invading the Soviet Union. Obviously, we know that the invasion of the Soviet Union by the Germans is kind of the first step toward losing the war, a big step toward losing the war for the Germans, because they're going to lose millions on the Eastern Front fighting against the Soviets that could have been used in other parts of the war. But the argument is, of course, always, well, they had to do it because they needed to get that oil in the Caucasus. And I understand that argument, but the fact that they never ended up getting all of that oil on a permanent basis the way that they tried, and the amount of oil that they then expended in the invasion of the Soviet Union means that in hindsight it was an unnecessary and a stupid decision, because they were doing a premeditated attack, basically anticipating that that oil was going to be cut off. But like I said, they expend a bunch and then they don't get it anyway. So what if they just don't do that? You save all the oil that you would have used on your planes, on your tanks, on your men invading the Soviet Union, and hopefully, in your case, you continue to get that oil that you're trading for with the Soviet Union. Different story. So I don't buy the excuse of needing the oil as necessitating that war, because it ended up not working out for him anyway.
And this is where the resource war and the terrible ideology of the Third Reich merge. While there were a number of military men who suggested that the fascist war machine should break through North Africa and come to possess the oil fields of the Middle East, Hitler, with his need for Lebensraum, his hatred of the Slavs and the Jews, and his foundational fear of communism, instead decided that the Nazi armies would move east into the heart of the Soviet Union and take...
And that's why I say that really this is more about ideology than it is about oil. Oil might have been how he sold it to his generals, but I really, truly believe in Hitler's mind this was about sticking it to people he hated.
Take possession of the Soviet oil fields. When this enormous effort stalled out, there were some desperate attempts to turn south and pick up oil fields closer to the Middle East, but by then it was too late. Germany had used most of its reserves pushing into Russia, and as a result would suffer shortages for the rest of the war. Japan faced a similar dilemma, but was perhaps in yet more dire straits, because the overwhelming majority of its trade before now had been with one single partner, the United States. Most Japanese planners recognized this deficiency, but also believed that any expansion in the Pacific would almost certainly draw them into conflict with the US. This led directly to a strategy that involved knocking the US out of the war as quickly as possible. But it also led to two other strategies for the coming conflict, a set of strategies that would divide the Japanese forces.
So the US basically uses the fact that they're providing most of this oil to the Japanese, which fuels their war machine. They use that as leverage to try and bring about a diplomatic solution to the Japanese conquests in Eastern Asia and in the South Pacific. They're basically threatening them, saying, put a stop to this or we're cutting you off. Well, Japan wasn't going to put a stop to it, and they knew they couldn't be cut off, so they had no choice.
The army favored what is known as Hokushin-ron, or the Northern Expansion Doctrine, which called for a push through China into the resource-rich country of Siberia. The central idea was that the army could simultaneously bring the majority of raw materials that their economy needed under Japanese control and cripple the Soviet Union's ability to prosecute a war against Japan. The Navy, on the other hand, advocated Nanshin-ron, or Southern Expansion Doctrine, which proposed sweeping up the islands in the South Pacific to solve Japan's economic shortfalls. And both of these doctrines would play a huge part in how the Japanese prosecuted the war. In the outset of the war, with the invasion of China, we see the beginning of the implementation of the Northern Expansion Doctrine. But though little talked about in the history of World War II, this approach ground to a halt when the Japanese tried to push up through Mongolia and were turned back by the Soviets at the battles of Khalkhin Gol. Over 100,000 men fought an undeclared war there, and at its end, the Japanese army was forced to abandon its dreams of Siberian conquest.
Yeah, we don't talk much about that there was some conflict that happens between the Soviets and the Japanese. We know that the Soviet Union declares war on Japan right at the end in 1945. They had agreed with the other Allied powers that so long after the capitulation of Germany that they would enter the war against Japan. And a lot of people argue that was a bigger factor than the atomic bombs were in Japan choosing to surrender. But there was some fighting that took place between them beforehand. Imagine if that had continued, how things might look differently.
Which left their navy ascendant and free to push the doctrine that would win it the most prestige. And thus began Japan's rapid expansion into the Pacific. The idea was to strip the European nations already beleaguered by the war in the West of all of their colonial possessions in Asia. And this became an utter necessity because by this point the United States, Britain, China, and the Dutch government in exile, who controlled the all-important Dutch East Indies, had put an embargo on Japan.
And I want to back up to something else he was talking about there with the Japanese doctrine. One of the biggest differences that you see between Japan and, say, some of the Allied powers is the coordination that is happening between the different branches of the military. In Japan, you've got a very strong rivalry between the Army and the Navy and the leaders of those, and the arguments that happen over doctrine, over strategy, really, I think, cripple the Japanese early in the war. Yes, that happens in every nation's military, but I think it hurt the Japanese more than most other powers.
Denying it nearly 80% of its oil. And though this empire was rolled back and finally shattered over the course of the coming years, it does lead me to one last thing I wanted to talk about. You see, as the Japanese expanded in the Pacific, they denied the Allies one key war material: rubber. 90% of the world's rubber production came from the territory overrun by the Japanese. So what did the Allies do? Left with no alternative, they synthesized rubber. At the beginning of the Second World War,
necessity is the mother of invention.
Only 0.4% of America's rubber was synthetic, but by the end, refineries dotted America, and techniques for synthesizing rubber had been established that underpin how we do it to this day. And even now, with no war or great international crisis, more of the world's rubber is synthesized than harvested. And this may seem like a small thing, but it tells us something very important about the Second World War. If World War I was the first truly industrial war, the first war where mass production and industrial capacity truly tipped the balance, World War II was the first scientific war, where things like radar, computing, and the atomic bomb would help to decide the world's fate. And
I get what they're saying. I think that a lot of that happened in World War I too, though.
not least among these scientific advances were synthetics. Without synthetics, the resource war may have been lost. And while the creation of synthetic forms of many natural resources may not get heralded the way that the radar or the jet engine do, it changed the war, and changed the world economy forever. So if you want to understand policy decisions in World War II, whether they be strategic or scientific, one good place to start is to follow the resources. I hope some of these episodes got you thinking in a new way about the Second World War. I know they're not our usual epic story fare, but we wanted to take this opportunity to talk about tactics, ideas, and policies that had a huge impact, but sometimes get glossed over in the grand scheme of things. This more or less concludes our discussion of resources in World War II, but as long as we're talking World War II, we wanted to take a closer look at the Battle of Britain. So we'll see you soon for that.
So I think there's one more episode of this, though, isn't there? Let me check real quick. Yeah, so they have a fourth episode, which is about the strategic bombing that takes place. So we'll be taking a look at that one tomorrow. But let me know your thoughts. I've really enjoyed this. This is such a great kind of alternative way of looking at, what is one of the defining moments of human history. And I think it's so important in understanding what was going on in World War II by looking at the resources. So let me know your thoughts. Add to the conversation. Let's learn together. And I'll see you tomorrow with episode 4. Thanks for watching. Welcome back, everyone, to the fourth and final part of the Resource War from Extra History. It's been a fantastic series. I feel like we've learned a lot. So as with all of the videos, the link is in the description to the original content as well as to the first episode of my reaction if you want to get caught up if you haven't seen the first 3 episodes. But let's go ahead and dive into strategic bombing.
Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life and the long continuity of our institutions and our empire. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that, if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour. Winston Churchill uttered those words on June 18th, 1940.
So a couple of things about Churchill's finest hour speech there. First of all, remember, he's only been prime minister for a month at that point. The day he takes office as prime minister is the day that the Germans invade France and start the war on the Western Front. because it had been what they called the phony war to that point. France and Britain had declared war on Germany as soon as they attacked Poland in September 1939, but there really hadn't been any fighting on the ground on the Western Front. But the other thing is, notice he very specifically mentions the United States. One of Churchill's priorities was getting the U.S. involved in any way possible as quickly as possible. He understood that the British needed a strong ally in the U.S. and they needed the U.S. to get involved as quickly as they could. Now, you have to remember, we take for granted what we call the special relationship, this alliance that exists between the UK and the United States. But it wasn't that old at that point. Remember, the US and the UK fight two wars, the Revolution and then the War of 1812. And even by the time you get to the First World War, there are a lot of Americans who were just as quickly ready to sign up for the side of the Axis in that war, because there's a lot of German Americans, as there were ready to fight on the side of the Allies. There was a lot of mistrust between the U.S. and the U.K. And so after World War I, that relationship starts to strengthen, starts to deepen, but it's still not the alliance we think of today.
3 weeks later, the Battle of Britain would begin. And it truly was their finest hour.
Yeah.
One small island stood together against the greatest military force the world had ever known.
And let's not forget that it wasn't just British. The best and most successful squadron in the Battle of Britain was a Polish squadron. And incredible story that I think we'll have to dive into at some point.
One last light of democracy stood burning against the fascist darkness. And as the darkness closed in, they fought to keep it burning with a resolve, a tenacity that no one in the world expected. And though the heroism of those exhausted air crews that day and night served as the steel wall of England deserve all the credit we can give them, this was a battle won by a nation. It was not only won in the sky over the English Channel, it was won in the radar stations that dotted the coast. It was won in the munitions factories and on the tarmacs. It was won in the research labs and in the code-breaking facilities. It was won by a people, not just a military, and everybody thought that those people would break. Someday I would love to dig into the full story of the Battle of Britain, as it is one of the most powerful stories of modern history. But today, we want to
100%.
tell it from a point at which it turned. From the point at which it stopped being a battle between two military forces, a battle which the fascists might have been able to win, to a battle of a military against a people. A battle the Nazis never had a chance at. It's the night of August 25th, 1940. A German bomber crew is flying over the English countryside. They've been tasked with taking out oil tanks at Rochester and at Thameshaven. But something's wrong. They've been flying too long, their fuel is low, and they still haven't seen their target. Should they press on? They've already passed the terrifying cordon of British air defense. They can't turn back now. But still, they see nothing. No, wait, there's something. Buildings, an urban area, this must be it. They open their bomb bay doors, and their bombs drop. But it wasn't the fuel reserves at Rochester and Thameshaven that bomber crew was flying over. Those bombs fell on London. They had bombed the biggest civilian center in the UK. There was outrage. Winston Churchill, assuming it was a deliberate attack, ordered a retaliatory strike on Berlin.
And even if it's not a deliberate attack, which there's no indication that it was, there's no proof of that, but it's great propaganda when you tell your people it was a deliberate attack. Look at these evil Germans bombing our civilians, our cities. And every country's going to do this on either side. They're going to spin everything they can for the greatest psychological advantage they can get.
These RAF bombers were supposed to target commercial and industrial targets, but they too missed their targets at the cost of German civilian lives. And like that, the gloves were off. Hitler, who had previously ordered the Luftwaffe not to intentionally target civilians, now rescinded that command. And on September 7th, one of the largest coordinated bombing raids with nearly 1,000 bombers spread out over 32 kilometers commenced. Their target? London, the heart of the British Empire. The idea was that if they could break the people of London, maybe they could break the empire itself. The Battle of Britain raged for months. German losses were mounting, but the RAF was also on the ropes. The hope on the German side was that this would be the knockout blow, that without enough air power to defend their major cities, the average citizen would lose faith in the government's ability to protect them and break.
And this is also an intentional strategy in lieu of a military invasion, because they didn't have control of the seas. The German Kriegsmarine was never going to be able to go toe to toe with the British Navy, the Royal Navy. So they've got to win this in the air, and they've got to pummel them into submission to where they'll negotiate. And this probably would have been easier if Edward VIII was still king, because he was much more willing to kind of be more favorable toward the Germans, and we see that happening throughout the war.
Under the constant threat. The truth, though, was that if the Luftwaffe ever had a real chance of winning the Battle of Britain, it was right there on the week of the 7th, by not attacking the populace. The RAF was exhausted and worn down to the point where another week of concerted attack might have broken them. But instead, this massive diversion of resources to attack targets that didn't really reduce the RAF's capacity to fight gave them just the space they needed to come back and then smash the raids on London. On September 15th, Germany made one last push to break London, and instead was herself broken. In the massive air battle that ensued, with nearly 2,000 planes in the air over London, the Germans were repelled and
I get that London is a huge city, and it is. It's a wonderful city. I've been there a few times now. I'm going to be back there in a few days. But could you imagine 2,000 bombers over any single place in the world? What that's got to do to your psyche, and what that's got to do just in terms of the sheer number of bombs that were dropped. But that just shows you something about the British people, right? That this made them double down and gave them even more resolve rather than less. Man, something like that would scare the bejesus out of me.
Reeling from recent defeats, canceled their planned invasion of Britain. They came up with a new plan, one which doubled down on the strategy of breaking the civilian populace. They would abandon the struggle for control of the air and focus on a campaign of terror that every night, when British air defenses were far less effective, sent waves of German bombers to deliver a payload of destruction to the streets of London. But in the end, this massive diversion of resources took more away from the Nazi war effort than it ever did from the Allies, which historically is actually almost always what happens with air-based campaigns.
And this is a great, maybe diversionary opportunity to talk about an alternate history. What if the Germans continue to focus on military targets? Does this change anything with the Battle of Britain and with the outcome of the war? Great question.
Since the dawn of aviation, it's been the dream of military strategists to win wars without ever putting troops on the ground. But short of the use of nuclear arms, it's practically never worked.
Yeah.
Whether it be the early attempts with Zeppelins in World War I, the Axis Blitz, or the Allied bombings of places like Dresden during World War II, the napalm campaigns of Vietnam, or the modern conflicts in the Middle East. And the Blitz makes this fact clear. As the Germans pursued this strategy further and further, it became increasingly evident that the cost in men and material to the German forces exceeded the actual economic damage they were inflicting, even when their goal was primarily to just grind the British economy to a halt.
And think about the aftermath of this then. This is kind of the height of German air power, and from this point on, now you're going to get concerted efforts by the Allies bombing the Germans on the mainland of Europe. And it's a huge turning point in the war.
As soon as the goal shifted toward breaking the will of the populace, the effect on wartime production became marginal at best. Month after month, British war production rose, and enlistment never slackened. And although nothing is as simple or as clear-cut as myth-making tends to make it, this also brought together the British people. As German bombs fell on London and casualties mounted, those with parents, siblings, and friends whose lives were cut short by the attacks didn't lose the will to fight. Quite the opposite. They instead became determined to never surrender. They threw...
And I feel like this is a really great time to read a very well-known speech, or at least part of it. Nothing really encapsulates the spirit of the British people the way that famous speech from Churchill in those desperate days in June of 1940, right? Where he basically says there's no scenario in which Germany wins this war, even if they invade us, right? We will fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. And even if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island or a large part of it were subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would carry on the struggle until, in God's good time, the New World, with all its power and might, read America right there, United States, steps forth to the rescue and the liberation of the old. Churchill's always putting in those little hints for the U.S. to get involved and help out. But man, I mean, have there been many speeches in human history that carried the weight and the power in the moment like that one did?
Themselves into the defense of Britain with a resolve that only comes from the deepest loss, and were prepared to make sacrifices that an unscarred population might never accept. You see, that's the thing about strategic bombing. Even when the objective is to strike industry or leadership targets, each civilian casualty, each incident of collateral damage, rather than breaking the enemy, just creates new groups who will forever oppose surrender.
That's 100% true. I mean, can somebody give me an example? And I'm sure it's happened. Can somebody give me an example in the comment section of a time when a terror campaign like this actually worked to subdue a population rather than instill them with an even stronger resolve to fight back?
And the Blitz also created a sense of national unity through shared struggle. Everybody who lived through the Blitz, rich and poor, shared a commonality that crossed many previous divides. And whether it was spending nights huddled together in a shelter, manning a civil defense gun, or working together on a volunteer fire crew, the Blitz literally brought people together. It made them understand each other and rely on each other as they'd never done before. And again, although nothing's ever as rosy as we remember, in the end, the Blitz did more to unify Britain than to divide it. And I think that concludes this look back at World War II. For now, anyway. I hope you folks enjoyed it.
Fantastic series. Really enjoyed it. I hope you guys did as well. If you have suggestions or requests for things you'd like to see me do reactions to, let me know in the comment section below. I'm recording a bunch of reaction videos ahead of time since I'm going to be away for 9 days coming up here with the trip to Europe. But you will be seeing a lot of content coming from that, as well as more videos from my recent battlefield visit to Shiloh. Thanks for watching.